We're now joined in the studio by the former Cabinet Minister, leading Leave campaigner, Duncan Smith. Duncan Smith, what is wrong with the judges of the High Court saying that the people, the referendum they understand, but the manner in which the process now takes place has to be approved by Parliament?
Well, I wrote a piece about this today to say that actually I think this is a wider issue than Article 50. I think we are in the middle of a battle between the courts and Parliament. Whether or not you agree about the Article 50 point, the real problem here is that it is not, in my view, and in the view of many constitutional lawyers, the position of the courts to rule on procedures in Parliament and how Parliament goes about its business. Parliament can call the government in at any time it likes. It can hold any number of debates. It was made clear at the time that the 72 Act will have to be repealed. That means that there will be legislation in the House absolutely locked to the Article 50 process. So all of this is already what the government has said they will do. And what the courts have done is they have said, no, they know better than this. They know now, and they direct Parliament that the use of the executive power now can only be used in regard to this triggering of Article 50 by legislation in the House of Commons. Now that is stepping beyond a line they have ever crossed before, and that is about them putting themselves above the democratic elected.
But what is wrong with the government laying before Parliament its decision to trigger Article 50 and give a broad outline of how it intends to deliver on Brexit? What would be wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that, and they can do it any time they like.
So why argue with the courts?
No, what is wrong about this is actually what the courts have said, is that they cannot trigger Article 50 without the permission of the Commons, and then also the Lords, because it's Parliament they're talking about. Now, the problem with this is that actually this flies in the face of what happened when we passed the referendum bill. This was a sovereign act of Parliament that handed back to the British people the sovereign right to make the decision about whether we stayed in or we left. This is not about discussing terms of what happens. All this is about triggering Article 50. You have to trigger Article 50 to start the process of leaving. So this is the question about, can the government say, we are triggering Article 50? Not, can the government say, what we will negotiate? It's, can the government say, we now trigger Article 50? The British people made that decision. All the government is meant to do now is decide at what point they trigger it. They can debate everything else after that. Parliament will do that, but not the decision to trigger Article 50. That has been made.
But why?
It's just a case of timing.
I understand that the referendum result gave the government a mandate to trigger Article 50. I'd appreciate that. But why should Parliament vote for a blank cheque? As Owen Smith was saying, it's not exactly clear what basis we will leave the EU, and therefore is it not the job of Parliament to hold the government's feet to the fire to say we need to know in triggering Article 50 what you are intending to do, to give us an idea of what life outside the EU will be like?
Yes, and that can go on, and that will be ad nauseum. There will be endless debates about that. They could call a debate on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday in the House of Commons. We can have 2 days of debates. The government will give way and give debates. That's not the issue, then.
But the issue isn't debates. The issue is legislation whereby
but that is going to
we
go to the
can
House.
lay down what
Andrew,
the conditions will be.
This is converging two issues, and they shouldn't be. They need to be separated. Triggering of Article 50, the decision has been made. It was made by the British people. They had the sovereign right to make it. This is not about the decision to trigger Article 50. This is therefore now confused by Owen Smith about what then is the government's negotiating position. That's a wholly different argument. And the Parliament has the right to know about that and discuss it. I don't have a problem with that. That is exactly the point. The government has said by the end of that they will have a vote. You know, the 72 Act covers every single aspect of our membership of the European Union. That can be amended to hell
Let me ask you this.
by the Lords and by the Commons. That will be the case.
But David Davis has said that it now looks like the government will have to bring forward an Act of Parliament. And I would suggest to you that the Act of Parliament will be more than just a motion to trigger Article 50. They will have to say more than that. If that becomes a wrangle in Parliament, if that becomes, as Owen Smith and others will try to amend and change and all the rest of it, does that make the prospect of an early election more likely?
Well, this is obviously a decision that finally the government has to make, although I have to say the Constitution, as we reset it, which I was never much in favour of, means that becomes...
Well, Labour would have to vote for it.
It becomes
too,
more difficult, so I don't know about that. My simple point is two things on what you just said. The first is, I'm not absolutely convinced anyway, even if the Supreme Court comes back and upholds this decision, that you need legislation in that sense. It is feasible to have a vote on this if that is what the... Because remember, the courts have not said and cannot say you must legislate.
No, the court did not say what we should vote on.
Exactly right, and nor can they. So it could be for Parliament to have a vote. Shall the government have the power to trigger Article 50, yes or no?
You could win that vote.
Well, maybe. My point, though, is the reason I argue this is because I think there's a wider issue here.
I understand.
And the second point about the general election is, of course, if, and this is really what the issue's about, and you got to it with Owen Smith quite well, I thought, you made the point that his whole purpose in life is not to accept the decision of the British people and to slow it down and stop it. That's the reality of it. If it gets to that point with legislation, then I think that is when you start thinking about whether a new mandate is required.
Where is this going for the government?
Oh, yes, chaos. I mean, you hear the country's divided more than ever. You watched Question Time last night. There was sheer divide between the inners and outers. And it's interesting to hear Owen Smith talking about revisionism, because that is what, this verdict yesterday has let all those people back in. Owen Smith, Nick Clegg, all those people who were shouting on the sidelines, wanting a say, they're now in.
So what do you think will the government do?
I think if it's primary legislation, I can't see how they avoid a general election. If it goes down that route and all the amendments pile in, I cannot see how they avoid that.
But is that right? I mean, if you look at the arithmetic there, I was looking at some of the figures. There will be some Tory rebels, but maybe not a huge number that would actually defy the government in the end. A lot of Labour, plus the government can count on the DUP, so its majority is about 23 in an issue like this at least. A lot of Labour MPs, Owen Smith notwithstanding, particularly in the north, will be very reluctant to do anything to derail this.
We're talking about niche arguments. Owen Smith in Parliament at the moment is making a niche argument. There simply isn't the appetite to not vote to trigger Article 50. That in itself, I don't think, comes under question. Northern MPs, Labour MPs, so many of them may have passionately campaigned for Remain. They saw what happened in their own constituencies. They wouldn't do that to themselves. But, and this is where I disagree with Ian, actually the question is simply about whether or not there is something further in this that will allow MPs to have a say on what Brexit looks like.
There's
and
plenty
that
of scope
is
to
where...
do that. I'm sorry, there's plenty of scope to do that. The trouble is there's a lot of ignorance around about the workings of Parliament. The passing of the getting rid of the 72 Act gives you absolute scope. It is a full act. It will go all the way through both houses. You can amend everything in it. It applies all European law. It also then will have to disapply it. Everything is in that.
But that would be a nightmare for the government.
But that is already what they are doing.
That would make Maastricht look like a holiday.
Well, my point is, and this is why...
Hold on a second. Need to worry.
This is why you've just said something completely incorrect. You said the real issue is about what there is in there over the debate. Parliament is going to be debating that ad nauseum. You'll be sick and tired of that in a year's time, writing this up. My point is, this is not about that.
Gotta let me
We need to be
respond.
very clear. Yeah. This is about whether the government has the right, under executive power, to trigger Article 50 in line with the sovereign vote that the British people made. That is why so many constitutional lawyers find this absolutely absurd of the High Court to have stepped across the line and told Parliament how to order its affairs.
On that point, Brexiteers, though I understand why they are suspicious, because parliamentarians were overwhelmingly in favour of Remain, do not need to worry, in my opinion. Parliament will not block a vote on Article 50.
I'm not worrying about that.
And the thing you will need to worry about, in whatever form it takes, whether, as you're suggesting, or perhaps somehow linked to this, is whether, in fact, they want to debate on something that might look like Remain through the back door. For example, the issue on the single market or the issue on the customs union.
That is going to happen.
But Anushka in today's Guardian, Polly Toynbee is saying MPs should ignore constituents and vote in the national interest.
But I don't think
for
MPs
Brexit.
are going to do that.
I know, but that's what people are fearing. This is what they
But
think
the
is going to
Lords,
happen.
and here's the point. Can I just make this point? This is really what she's talking about. She's talking to the Lords. And the truth is, we know in the House of Lords, and now you've already heard members of the House of Lords saying they have a duty to ignore and defy that vote. And they want to do it over Article 50's triggering. They don't want to mess around in the midst of it. They really want to stop Article 50. So that's my point, why the courts stepping into this have actually stepped across the line and put Parliament in a constitutional crisis with the British people. The people had the sovereign right, and now we're defying that.
But also remember...
No, I'm sorry, we're going to have to start, and there we're going to move on, and we'll be, once we get the American election out of the way, we'll come back to this.
No one will care about this then.
Ian Duncan, well, they will after
Yeah.
next Tuesday. Ian Duncan Smith, thanks for that. A lot more questions still to answer on this as we move into uncharted territory.